Welcome to the fifth episode of Oblivion Good Content. In today's episode, I'll be dissecting one of the game's more popular mysteries. And like most of the weird stuff in Oblivion, it takes place in the town of Coral. To start off with our subject, we'll need to listen to the random dialogue of the townsfolk.
I could be wrong, but it seems to me there's something shady going on at the Oak Crosier.
Do you think? I've never noticed anything. I've suspected that as well. Still, it's not a bad place.
So, by now you've probably caught on to what's actually going on here. The townsfolk talk about shady business at the Oak Crosier, but there is literally nothing going on with said inn. Or is there? Well, there is something to go off, but not much. When you enter the basement of the Oak Crosier, the dungeon exploration music plays. Why? Well, because whatever nefarious practices would have been happening here, their source would likely be said basement. Normally, that would actually be where this video ends, because there's very little information about this mystery. But there's one small piece of evidence that basically solves it all. The evidence comes in the form of three empty dialogue topics. Renrija Kryn Talasma, Renrija Kryn Talasma yes, and Renrija Kryn Talasma no. Now of course, because these topics are empty, we don't know what exactly Talasma would have said, but apparently it would have been a question to which the player could have answered with either yes or no. Most importantly, however, is that the topic that would have initiated this question is called Renrija Kryn. For those that need a quick refresher on what that exactly is, I'll let an expert take the word.
Drell's Theron. I'm the Count's Special Inquisitor in charge of suppressing the Renrija Kryn insurgents. The Renrija Kryn are Khajiit bandits and smugglers, posing as guerrillas and freedom fighters.
The Renrija Kryn, and yes, I'm going with that pronunciation since even the Khajiit/Argonian voice actors aren't quite sure of how to pronounce it, and Renrija is the most used one, are a group of Khajiit bandits and seem to be mostly comprised of skooma smugglers, if the rumors are to be believed.
The skooma trade is making a lot of money for the tribes and elsewhere, and a lot of that is going to the Renrija Kryn. Sounds like the Empire has given up on stopping the skooma trade and elsewhere. And I hear tribal chiefs are supporting the Renrija Kryn.
That skooma trade is bad business. And the Renrija Kryn are just a bunch of thugs.
That skooma trade is bad business. And the Renrija Kryn are just a bunch of thugs.
The interesting thing is that while they are never seen in-game and only mentioned a handful of times, it seems that Talasma was to be associated with them at the very least. If everything we've discovered up to now indicates something, it seems that originally Talasma would have had either smugglers or smuggled goods, likely skooma, inside of the inn's basement. Maybe even both. A small blurb inside of the official Oblivion strategy guide also hints at something interesting. It reads as follows. Proprietor Talasma offers room and board. Given the perception in town that the Oak's an upscale establishment, the rooms is surprisingly cheap 10 gold. Given the perception in town, In the final game, Talasma is just portrayed as a stuck-up character, but it seems to me that it was intended for this to be a ruse, in order to distract from her shady side business. This side business likely provided her with enough funds to keep the room cheap. This sounds like an interesting concept, but Oblivion apparently wanted to keep those to a minimum in the final game. We've almost covered everything there is to this content, with the exception of one thing. There actually is a faction for the Renrija Kryn inside of the game's files, but it seemingly got repurposed. There is one NPC in the final game that's still a part of the faction, and that's Crosier, who's a Khajiit treasure hunter encountered in the quest Nothing You Can Possess, and the faction just serves to set up his relations with the player during the quest. It could be that this faction is supposed to hint at Crosier's allegiance, but it's never mentioned that he's supposed to be a member of the Kryn, not even in the game guide. The faction also isn't named after the quest, indicating that at the very least the faction was made as an afterthought, but I'm still convinced that the faction was just repurposed. So yeah, at some point during development there really would have been shady business at the Oak Crosier, and Talasma was involved with the Renrija Kryn at some point, but they sadly didn't carry over this idea into the final game. Would you have liked to explore a bit more of the Khajiit culture through the Renrija Kryn? Let me know in the comments below, as well as any suggestions for topics. And I'll see you all in the next episode.